Welcome. Settle in, find a comfortable position, and let your body begin to relax. Tonight, we're going to travel somewhere. Not to a calm meadow or an imaginary sea of clouds, but to a very real sea, under a very real sun several hundred years ago. We're going to the Caribbean, and we're going to trace the story of how some of history's most daring, most desperate, and most surprisingly sophisticated people built entire economies out of nothing but salt water, stolen silver, and the audacity to believe that the old rules did not apply to them. The story we're going to tell tonight is this. Somewhere between the years 1620 and 1730, a collection of islands in the Caribbean Sea became home to something genuinely extraordinary. A series of communities that operated outside the control of any European empire, that created their own codes of law, their own systems of shared profit, their own hierarchies of command, and their own surprisingly modern financial structures. These communities were pirate republics, and they were not simply bands of violent men stumbling from ship to ship. They were funded, they were organised, they had backers, investors, intermediaries, and silent partners. They had a whole shadow economy propping them up from below, invisible to most eyes, essential to everything. That shadow economy is what we're going to explore tonight. We're going to follow the money. We're going to ask where it came from, who moved it, who profited from it, and how a system that everyone officially condemned in public somehow managed to thrive because so many people quietly encouraged it in private. By the time we are finished, the word pirate will mean something richer and stranger and more layered to you than it did when you lay down. But before we get to the pirates themselves, we have to understand the world they were born into. Because nothing about piracy in the Caribbean makes sense without understanding what the Caribbean actually was, and what it meant to the European powers who spent the better part of 2 centuries fighting over it. Imagine the year 1500. Columbus has made his first crossings. Word has begun to filter back to the courts of Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands that there is something out there beyond the western horizon. Not a short route to Asia, as Columbus had hoped, but something else entirely. Something vast, something green and wet and warm and full of things that European merchants had never seen before. There were islands, hundreds of them, scattered across a sea so blue and so clear that sailors who had spent their whole lives on the grey North Atlantic could not quite believe what they were looking at. There were fruits no European had ever tasted. There were animals that had no names in any European language. And there was gold, or at least the promise of it, glinting from the ornaments of the people who already lived there, the Taino and the Arawak and the Carib, peoples who had built their own civilizations across these islands for thousands of years before any European ship darkened the horizon. Spain moved first, and Spain moved fast. Within a generation of Columbus, Spanish conquistadors had moved through the islands and onto the mainland, and they had found what they were looking for. Not just gold, but silver, staggering quantities of it, buried in the mountains of what is now Mexico and Peru and Bolivia. The silver mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia were among the richest ever discovered. At their peak in the late 1500s, they were producing more silver in a single year than all of Europe's mines combined had produced in a decade. The Spanish crown looked at this and felt something very close to a kind of divine certainty. God had clearly intended for Spain to be the richest empire in the history of the world. To protect this wealth and move it back to Europe, Spain built a system. It was called the Flotta system, the treasure fleet, and it was the most ambitious logistics operation that the early modern world had ever attempted. Twice a year, great convoys of ships would assemble in the ports of Havana and Cartagena and Veracruz, their holds packed with silver ingots and gold coins and cocoa and indigo and hides and pearls, and they would sail together across the Atlantic in a great organised procession, guarded by heavily armed warships called galleons, aiming for the port of Seville, where the Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, would receive the cargo and distribute it through the arteries of the Spanish economy. This system worked, after a fashion, but it also created something that the Spanish crown had not entirely anticipated. It created the most tempting target in the world. Twice a year, a predictable collection of ships moving along a predictable route, carrying an almost incomprehensible quantity of portable wealth. For anyone willing to intercept those ships, or to raid the ports where they gathered, the reward was extraordinary. The risk was extraordinary too, of course, but risk and reward have always had a way of attracting a certain kind of person, and the Caribbean in the 16th century was about to become full of exactly that kind of person. The other European powers watched Spain's wealth accumulate and felt something complicated, a mixture of envy and outrage, and a very practical kind of hunger. France made the first formal challenge. French privateers, sailors operating with royal permission to attack enemy shipping, began raiding Spanish ships in the Atlantic as early as the 1520s. England followed, and the relationship between England and Spain, officially peaceful on paper for much of the 16th century, was in practice a long Cold War conducted by proxy, with privateers doing the work that neither government wanted to claim in public. But the Caribbean itself remained, for most of this early period, predominantly Spanish. The other European powers had settlements in the smaller islands, but the big prizes, Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, the mainland ports, were Spanish, and Spanish soldiers guarded them. The sea lanes were nominally Spanish too, at least in the sense that Spain claimed them and was willing to use force against anyone who disagreed. For the men who would eventually build the pirate republics, this was the world they were entering, a world already defined by violence and contested ownership, already structured around the movement of enormous wealth, already full of desperate men willing to do dangerous things for the chance at a better life. It helps to think about who those men actually were, because the image of pirates as a sort of glamorous criminal aristocracy, the captain in the long coat, the ship bristling with cannon, the chest full of gold, is something that developed much later, mostly in novels and plays and eventually films. The reality of early Caribbean piracy was considerably grimmer and considerably more interesting. The men who became the first buccaneers were not for the most part born criminals or born adventurers. They were people who had run out of other options. The word buccaneer itself is revealing. It comes from the French boucan, which referred to a kind of wooden frame used to smoke meat, specifically the wild cattle and pigs that roamed the western end of Hispaniola, the island now divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. The first buccaneers were not pirates at all. They were hunters. They were mostly French, mostly poor, mostly men who had failed at something in Europe, a farm that failed, a debt that couldn't be repaid, a crime that needed escaping, and who had washed up on Hispaniola and discovered that they could survive by hunting the feral cattle that Spanish settlers had introduced and then largely abandoned when the colony moved elsewhere. They smoked the meat and the hides on their boucan frames and sold them to passing ships. The Spanish, irritated by these squatters on what they considered their island, periodically sent soldiers to drive them out or kill them. The buccaneers responded by learning to fight back, and then by acquiring ships, and then by discovering that a ship could be used for something much more profitable than transporting smoked meat. The transition from hunter to pirate was not, for most of these men, a sudden dramatic choice. It was a slow drift, driven by necessity and opportunity in roughly equal measure, through a world that had very little sympathy for anyone who did not have money or power, or the right connections to someone who did. This is something worth holding on to as we move through this story. The people who built the pirate economy were not, in most cases, operating outside of the logic of the world around them. They were operating according to that logic more honestly than most. The world they lived in was one in which violence was routinely used to steal enormous wealth from people who could not defend themselves, in which the powerful made rules that protected their own interests and called it law, in which the distance between a licensed privateer and an unlicensed pirate was essentially the distance between having the right paperwork and not having it. The buccaneers looked at this world, understood it perfectly, and decided to participate in it on their own terms. The island of Tortuga sits just off the northern coast of Hispaniola, a small crescent of land about 30 miles long and no more than 5 miles wide at its broadest point. From the sea it looks like almost nothing, a low green ridge rising from the water, unremarkable, easy to overlook, which was, in the middle of the 17th century, precisely its most important quality. It was easy to overlook. It was also, for the small community of buccaneers who had taken refuge there after being driven off Hispaniola by the Spanish, essentially impossible to attack. The northern coast of Tortuga faces a deep harbour, sheltered from storms, accessible through a narrow channel that could be defended by a handful of men with cannons. The southern shore is cliffs. There is nowhere to land a large force. The buccaneers understood this intuitively, the way that people who have been hunted learn to understand landscape, not as something beautiful or abstract, but as something practical, something that can keep you alive or get you killed. They fortified the harbour. They built a rough wooden fort on the hill above it. They planted gardens and kept pigs and smoked their meat and sold provisions to whatever ships came through, and they gradually, organically, without any grand plan or founding charter, turned Tortuga into something that served a function the Caribbean had never had before, a place where anyone could come, regardless of nationality or background, as long as they were willing to follow certain basic rules and pay their share. What were those rules? They were, in their early form, mostly unwritten, mostly enforced by social pressure and the very real threat of violence from one's peers, and mostly concerned with the fair distribution of what was taken. This is one of the most remarkable and least discussed aspects of early Caribbean piracy, its obsession with equity. The buccaneers did not operate on a system where the captain kept everything and the crew got wages. They operated on a system of shares, a system that was, in some respects, more democratic and more egalitarian than anything that existed in the legitimate world around them. Here is how it worked in its basic form. Before any voyage, whether a hunting expedition or a raiding expedition, the captain and the crew would agree on a set of terms. These terms covered everything: what each man's share of the profits would be, how prizes would be valued and divided, what compensation would be paid for injuries, and what the captain's authority would be during the voyage versus what decisions required a vote. These terms were written down, signed or marked by every man aboard, and kept by the captain and a designated officer, usually called the quartermaster, whose specific job was to represent the crew's interests against the captain's authority. The compensation schedule for injuries was particularly striking. A typical set of buccaneer articles from the mid-17th century might specify that the loss of a right arm would be compensated at a rate of 600 pieces of 8, or alternatively 6 slaves. The loss of a left arm was worth 500 pieces of 8, or 5 slaves. The loss of a right leg, 500 pieces of 8. Left leg, 400. An eye, 100. A finger, the same. These were real, negotiated, written down agreements, and they predate formal workers' compensation laws by more than 200 years. They existed because the people who made them understood from hard experience that a man who knew he would be provided for if he was wounded would fight harder than a man who knew he would simply be left on a beach if he lost a hand. The captain's share in this system was larger than anyone else's, typically double or triple the ordinary sailor's portion, but it was not unlimited, and it was not a given. A captain who performed badly, who made poor decisions, who was cruel without purpose or cowardly in the face of danger, could be voted out of command mid-voyage. This actually happened. There are recorded instances of buccaneer captains being deposed by their crews and replaced on the spot with someone more capable or more popular, and then, remarkably, continuing as ordinary crew members for the rest of the voyage. This kind of accountability simply did not exist in the regular naval or merchant world, where a captain's authority was absolute and dismissing him was mutiny. The economic structure that surrounded these voyages was more complicated than the simple division of shares among a crew, and understanding it requires understanding who else was involved, because a pirate ship did not exist in isolation. It needed a place to sell what it captured, a place to repair and refit between voyages, a place to buy food and water and ammunition and rope and all the other supplies that a working ship consumes at a remarkable rate. It needed, in other words, an infrastructure. And that infrastructure had to be paid for by someone. In the early days on Tortuga, this infrastructure was provided partly by the buccaneers themselves, collective labour, collective investment in the fortifications and the gardens, and partly by a small but growing class of merchants and outfitters who saw an opportunity. These men, many of them French, some of them Dutch, a few of them English, arrived on Tortuga with goods to sell and goods to buy. They brought powder and shot and canvas and rum and salted, provisions, They left with smoked meat, hides, and, increasingly, the plunder of Spanish ships and Spanish ports. The relationship between these merchants and the buccaneers they supplied was not simply commercial, it was also financial in the more specific sense of involving credit and investment. A buccaneer captain preparing for a voyage did not always have the cash or the goods to provision his ship outright. He needed to borrow. The merchants on Tortuga were willing to lend, but they charged for it, sometimes in the form of interest on loans of cash, sometimes in the form of a percentage of whatever the voyage returned. This was, functionally, venture capital. The merchant on the shore was investing in the voyage the same way that later investors would invest in trading expeditions to the East Indies, putting up money in exchange for a share of the returns, with the understanding that if the voyage failed, the investment was lost. The rate of these arrangements reflected the risk. A legitimate trading voyage to relatively safe waters might attract investors willing to accept a modest return. A raiding voyage against Spanish shipping was considerably more dangerous. The Spanish would shoot back, and even if they didn't, the legal consequences of being caught were severe, and so the returns demanded by investors were correspondingly higher. Some of the arrangements on Tortuga in the 1640s and 1650s effectively gave the outfitter a third of everything the voyage returned, in exchange for providing the provisions and equipment for the voyage. For a very successful raid, this could be an extraordinary return on investment. For a failed or captured voyage, it was simply a loss. What made this system function was the physical infrastructure of Tortuga itself, the fact that there was a place where plunder could be brought and sold. The goods taken from Spanish ships needed buyers. Spanish silver and gold coin were useful anywhere, but a cargo of sugar or indigo or cacao, the kinds of bulk goods that a merchant ship might be carrying, needed to be sold to someone who could move it into legitimate markets. The merchants on Tortuga could do this because they had connections to the trade networks of France and the Netherlands and England, connections that allowed them to sell goods of uncertain origin without asking too many questions about where they had come from. This was the essential financial mechanism that made Caribbean piracy not just possible, but economically sustainable over generations. The existence of markets willing to absorb plundered goods at prices below their legitimate value, providing enough profit for everyone in the chain while erasing the trail of theft. Without those markets, the pirates would have had no way to turn their violence into lasting wealth. With them, every successful raid produced a cascade of economic activity. The fencers who bought the goods, the merchants who resold, them, the officials who looked the other way in exchange for a share of the proceeds, the sailors who spent their portions in the taverns and boarding houses of whatever port would have them. Piracy was not an interruption of the Caribbean economy. It was, in large stretches of the 17th century, a central engine of it. Alexander Exquemelin was a young Flemish man who arrived in the Caribbean in 1666 as an indentured servant, was sold several times, eventually joined the buccaneers out of something close to desperation, and spent the next several years sailing with some of the most successful pirates of the era. He later wrote a book about his experiences, published in Dutch in 1678, quickly translated into French, Spanish and English, that became one of the most important primary sources we have for the realities of buccaneer life. Exquemelin was not writing history. He was writing something between a memoir and a sensational adventure narrative aimed at a European audience hungry for exotic stories from the New World. But he was also, unusually for his time and genre, genuinely observant, and his descriptions of how buccaneer expeditions were organised and financed have a texture and specificity that more polished accounts lack. He describes, for instance, the process by which a captain assembled a crew for a major expedition. It was not a matter of press gangs or royal orders, it was essentially a public advertisement. The captain would put out word, in the taverns and boarding houses of Tortuga or Port Royal, or wherever the ship was currently based, that he was fitting out for a voyage, and that any man who wished to join should come and discuss terms. Prospective crew members would come aboard, inspect the ship, assess the captain's reputation and the likely quality of the voyage, and negotiate their share. If they liked what they heard, they signed the articles. If they didn't, they went elsewhere. This meant that a captain's reputation was genuinely important, in a way that a regular naval captain's reputation was not, because a naval captain could press men into service regardless of what they thought of him. A buccaneer captain had to attract his crew voluntarily, which meant he had to be known as someone who fought well, shared honestly, and gave his men a reasonable chance of coming home with money in their pockets. Captains who were known for cheating their crews, for fudging the accounting, for keeping more than their agreed share, found it difficult to recruit. Captains who were known for recklessness that got men killed found it equally difficult. The market for piracy was, in this sense, a genuine market, with real feedback mechanisms. Exquemelin also describes the social dynamics of life between voyages, and here too the economic dimension is inescapable. The buccaneers, when they returned from a successful raid, typically had more money than they had ever seen in their lives, and they spent it with extraordinary speed. The tavern keepers and inn owners and prostitutes and merchants of Tortuga and later Port Royal made small fortunes from the spending habits of men who had no particular reason to save, who expected to die young, and who believed, usually correctly, that another voyage would bring another windfall. This was not exactly what economists would call rational behaviour, but it had its own logic. A man who hoarded his money in a community with no banks and no legal property rights was just a target for theft. Spending it on pleasures that could not be stolen was, in a strange way, the most sensible thing to do with it. The merchants understood this, and many of them structured their businesses around it. They extended credit to buccaneers who were between voyages and broke, knowing that the debt would be repaid when the next voyage returned. They sold at high prices to men who had money and would not have it long. They took payment in goods as well as coin, knowing that they could sell those goods at a markup. The relationship between the merchant class and the pirate class in the early Caribbean was not merely transactional, it was mutually constitutive. There is a document in the National Archives in London, written on heavy vellum in the cramped secretary hand of a 17th century clerk, that authorised a man named Christopher Mings to attack, seize, and destroy Spanish ships and property in the Caribbean in the name of the English crown. It specified the ships he was allowed to use, the ports he was allowed to operate from, and the percentage of his prizes that was owed to the Lord High Admiral. It was signed and sealed by officials of considerable authority, and it was, on its face, a piece of perfectly legitimate government paperwork. What it was describing, of course, was piracy. State-sponsored piracy, carefully laundered through legal language, but piracy nonetheless. Christopher Mings went on to conduct raids on Spanish towns in Venezuela and Cuba that were, by any contemporary standard, acts of war. He burned towns, he killed people, he carried off enormous quantities of silver and goods. He did all of this in a period when England and Spain were officially at peace. And when the Spanish government protested to London, the English government expressed its regrets, convened an inquiry, and eventually called Mings home, where he was received not as a criminal, but as a successful naval commander, given a senior position in the Royal Navy, and eventually knighted. The letter of marque was the central legal fiction around which the entire legitimate piracy complex was organised. In its purest form, it was exactly what it claimed to be, a government licence authorising a private ship and crew to act as a naval auxiliary, attacking the shipping and ports of designated enemy nations in exchange for a share of the profits. It had a long history in European warfare, dating back at least to the 13th century, and it served a genuine strategic purpose. It allowed governments to project naval power without the enormous expense of maintaining large standing fleets in peacetime. A king who could not afford to keep 50 warships in the Caribbean could instead license 50 private captains to do more or less the same thing at their own expense and take a cut of whatever they captured. The problem was that this system required very clear rules about which nations were enemies and which were not, and the 17th century Caribbean was a place where those rules were in constant flux. England and Spain might be at peace in Europe, while their colonists in the Caribbean were in a state of permanent low-level warfare. France might be allied with England against the Dutch one year, and allied with the Dutch against England the next. A privateer operating under a letter of marque issued by, say, the governor of Jamaica had to navigate a constantly shifting landscape of treaties and declared wars and undeclared hostilities, and the temptation to simply ignore the finer points of international law and attack whoever seemed most profitable was very strong. This is where the letter of marque system began to dissolve into outright piracy. not at a single dramatic moment, but gradually through a series of individual decisions by individual captains who found that the distinction between a legitimate prize and an illegitimate one was more theoretical than practical, at least when you were 1,000 miles from any court that might adjudicate the difference. Henry Morgan is the figure whose career most perfectly illustrates this dissolution, and we will spend considerable time with him later in this story. But the structural point can be made with simpler examples. Consider the case of the letter of marque issued by the governor of Tortuga, a man named Bertrand d'Ogeron, in the 1660s. D'Ogeron was a fascinating character in his own right, an entrepreneurial Frenchman who had made and lost a fortune in the sugar trade and had arrived on Tortuga with a commission from the French West India Company to govern the island and develop it into a proper French colony. He found, upon arrival, that the island was already populated by several thousand buccaneers who had their own ideas about how things should be run, who owed allegiance to no particular nation, and who were not especially interested in becoming French colonists. D'Ogeron was smart enough to understand that he could not simply impose authority by force. He did not have enough soldiers, and the buccaneers had enough guns. Instead, he decided to co-opt them. He began issuing letters of marque in the name of France, authorizing the buccaneers to attack Spanish shipping and promising them a percentage of their prizes in exchange for nominal acknowledgement of French authority. This worked reasonably well as long as France was at war with Spain, which it often was. But it also created a population of several thousand armed men with ships and experience in violence who had been formally trained to think of raiding as a legitimate profession, and who, when France made peace with Spain and the letters of marque stopped flowing, did not simply put down their weapons and become farmers. This is the fundamental economic problem that every government that tried to use privateers eventually confronted. You could train men to be raiders, license them to raid, and profit from their raiding, but you could not reliably turn them off again when they were no longer convenient. The skills were the same skills. The ships were the same ships. The targets were all around them. The only thing that changed when a letter of marque expired or a peace treaty was signed was the paperwork, and paperwork had never stopped a hungry man from acting in his own interest. The French authorities were aware of this problem, and their solution was revealing. They simply continued to issue letters of marque on a semi-informal basis even during peace, turning a blind eye to raids on Spanish settlements that were technically illegal, taking their percentage of the proceeds under the table, and maintaining what historians have called a system of plausible deniability. The governor of Tortuga could always claim, if the Spanish ambassador came calling, that he had issued no recent authorizations. The men who conducted the raids could always claim, if captured by the Spanish, that they had been acting under French authority. The truth was somewhere in the middle, and nobody with any power had a strong incentive to establish it precisely. The economics of the letter of marque system extended far beyond the simple relationship between a government and its licensed pirates. They ramified through the entire commercial structure of the Caribbean colonies, creating a web of financial interests that made piracy not just tolerated but actively supported by people who would have loudly denied any connection to it. Consider the merchants of Port Royal, Jamaica, in the 1660s and 1670s, the period of Morgan's great raids. These were for the most part respectable men. They had warehouses and counting houses and agents in London and Barbados. They dressed well, attended church, and sat on the governing council of the colony. They were also, almost to a man, deeply invested in the privateering economy. They outfitted ships for raiding expeditions. They bought plundered goods at below market prices and resold them at full prices. They extended credit to privateers between voyages and collected interest when the voyages returned. They sold provisions and equipment to ships that were going out to attack people and stored the proceeds when those ships came back. None of this was, strictly speaking, illegal, because the letters of marque made the underlying activity legal. But the merchants also knew, everyone in Port Royal knew, that the distinction between a licensed privateer and an outright pirate was very thin, and that many of the men they were doing business with operated on both sides of that line depending on opportunity. The merchants were not naive. They were making a calculated bet that the profits justified the risks, and that their connections to colonial authorities, many of whom were themselves investors in privateering voyages, would protect them if things went wrong. This is the structure that historians have begun in recent decades to call the plunder economy of the 17th century Caribbean, and it is worth pausing for a moment to appreciate how thoroughly it penetrated every level of colonial society. At the bottom were the sailors and fighters, men with little to lose who took the greatest physical risks. Above them were the captains, who took somewhat less risk and had somewhat more to gain. Above them were the outfitters and provision merchants, who took much less physical risk and could potentially make enormous profits from a successful voyage without leaving shore. Above them were the colonial officials who issued the letters of marque and took their percentage of the prizes, and who protected the whole system with the authority of their offices. And above all of them, in London and Paris and Amsterdam, were men who received reports about the Caribbean, understood very well what was happening there, and chose, for reasons of state, of profit, or of simple indifference to distant violence, to let it continue. The letter of marque was the legal spine of this whole structure, the document that made the otherwise indefensible defensible. Without it, every raid was simply theft, and every raider was simply a criminal. With it, the same actions became part of a legitimate tradition of naval warfare, approved by the state, beneficial to commerce, and entirely compatible with a life otherwise lived in respectable society. The genius of the system, and it was in its way a kind of genius, was that it allowed the same people to conduct the same activities while maintaining two entirely different identities: the honest merchant, the loyal subject, the respected official, and simultaneously the investor in, enabler of, and profiteer from a system of organised robbery that would have been clearly criminal without the magic of royal authorisation. When that authorisation was withdrawn, or when the system of authorisation broke down entirely, as it did in the 1680s and 1690s, when the major European powers began genuinely trying to suppress piracy in the Caribbean, the scaffolding of respectability came away with it, and what was left was something rawer and more honest and much easier to condemn. But the thing itself, the underlying economic engine, continued running. It simply moved underground. If you could visit Tortuga in the year 1660, you would arrive in a harbour that was modest by European standards, but extraordinary by Caribbean ones. There would be perhaps a dozen ships anchored in the roads, some clearly warships, some clearly merchant vessels, some in a condition so disreputable that it was difficult to tell what they had started out as. Along the waterfront, a collection of wooden buildings, taverns mostly, but also warehouses, a few chandlers selling rope and canvas and provisions, a blacksmith who also did rough shipwright work, several establishments whose specific services were best left unspecified. Behind and above this waterfront strip, the hill rising steeply, gardens carved into its slopes, pigs and chickens running loose, a small church that doubled as a courthouse on the occasions when anyone bothered with formal legal proceedings. It was not a beautiful place, it was a functional one, and its function, by 1660, was something quite specific. It was the clearinghouse for a significant portion of the plundered wealth of the Spanish Caribbean. The man most responsible for turning Tortuga from a rough buccaneer camp into something approaching an organised commercial hub was a Frenchman named Jean Levasseur, who had arrived on the island in 1640 with a commission from the French West India Company and an engineering background that proved unexpectedly valuable. Levasseur built the fort that made Tortuga defensible, a stone structure on a promontory above the harbour, equipped with cannon that could sweep both the harbour mouth and the beach below, and then used that fort as leverage to establish himself as the island's de facto ruler. He was by all accounts a deeply unpleasant man, paranoid, autocratic, prone to sudden violence, with a habit of conducting his private life in ways that scandalised even the buccaneers, who were not easily scandalised. He was eventually murdered by two of his own lieutenants in 1652, for reasons that historians have never entirely disentangled from the web of personal grievances, financial disputes, and political rivalries that characterise life on Tortuga. But before his murder, Levasseur had accomplished something genuinely important. He had demonstrated that Tortuga could be not just a refuge but a base, a place from which organised, sustained, financially sophisticated raiding operations could be mounted, and to which they could profitably return. He had established the precedent of a governor taking a percentage of all prizes brought in exchange for providing protection, a market for plunder, and a degree of administrative order. and he had attracted to the island exactly the kind of men who would build on those precedents. Merchants with capital to invest, captains with ambitions beyond simple raiding, and the first generation of what we might call pirate financiers, men whose contribution to any particular voyage was not their fighting skills or their seamanship, but their money and their connections. The French historian Alexandre Béguin de Meaux, writing in the 19th century, spent years tracing the commercial networks that operated out of Tortuga in the mid-17th century, and what he found was considerably more sophisticated than the image of a pirate camp would suggest. The island had, by the 1650s, a functioning credit system, not a bank, nothing so formal as that, but a web of informal lending relationships among the merchants and outfitters, in which goods and money moved through a set of recognised intermediaries who maintained accounts and settled debts according to their own agreed-upon rules. The unit of account was typically the piece of 8, the Spanish silver coin that was the closest thing the Caribbean had to a universal currency, but transactions were also conducted in goods, in promises of future payment, and in shares of future voyages. The outfitting of a buccaneer voyage from Tortuga in, say, 1658 would have looked something like this. A captain, let us call him Pierre because many of them were Pierre, has a ship, or access to a ship, and a reputation good enough to attract a crew. Pierre needs provisions for 60 men for 3 months, plus powder, shot, extra rope, canvas for repairs, and perhaps a few extra weapons. He goes to one of the merchants on the waterfront, a man who has been on the island for years, who knows everyone, who keeps a careful mental account of who owes what to whom. Pierre and the merchant negotiate. The merchant will provide everything Pierre needs. Let us say the total value is 400 pieces of 8, in exchange for 1/5 of whatever the voyage returns. If the voyage returns nothing, the merchant loses his 400 pieces of 8. If the voyage returns 4,000 pieces of 8, the merchant gets 800 of them, doubling his investment. If the voyage returns 40,000 pieces of 8, which was not impossible for a really successful raid, the merchant gets 8,000, a 20-fold return. These numbers were not hypothetical. The records that survive from Tortuga and later from Port Royal show voyages, returning exactly these kinds of figures. Modest investments in provisions and equipment generating enormous returns when a raid on a well-stocked Spanish town or a valuable merchant fleet succeeded. The risk was real and the losses were real too. Voyages that never returned, or that returned with nothing, were common enough that no sensible merchant put all his money into a single voyage. Diversification was a practical necessity, not a sophisticated investment theory. A merchant who had money in 5 different voyages was much more likely to survive the failure of any one of them than a merchant who had bet everything on a single captain. This diversification created what we would now recognise as a portfolio approach to investment in violence. The merchants of Tortuga were, without using any modern financial terminology, managing risk. They were spreading their capital across multiple ventures, balancing the higher risk, higher reward voyages against the lower risk, lower reward ones, and using the proceeds of successful voyages to finance the next generation of expeditions. It was, in its basic structure, exactly what the joint stock companies of the same era were doing in the East Indies trade. The same logic applied to a different and bloodier commodity. The role of the fence. The person who bought plundered goods and converted them into cash or resaleable merchandise was in some ways even more important than the role of the outfitter, because without a functioning resale market, the whole system broke down. A buccaneer captain who came back to Tortuga with a hold full of Spanish cacao had wealth in a form he could not easily use. He needed someone who would buy the cacao, and that someone needed connections to markets elsewhere, France or England or Holland, where cacao could be sold legitimately, without anyone asking too carefully about its provenance. The men who performed this function were among the most interesting and least celebrated figures in the history of Caribbean piracy. They were not typically pirates themselves. They were merchants with feet in 2 worlds, the legitimate world of transatlantic trade, where they had relationships with commission houses in Nantes and Amsterdam and London, and the shadow world of Tortuga, and later Port Royal, where they bought goods that had been stolen and sold them at a markup through channels that did not ask questions. The legitimate and the illegitimate were not 2 separate systems that happened to exist alongside each other. They were the same system, with different labels applied to different parts of it depending on who was looking. Consider the case of the Dutch merchants of Curaçao. The island of Curaçao, a Dutch colony since 1634, was one of the great commercial hubs of the 17th century Caribbean. The Dutch West India Company had established it as a transshipment point for the slave trade, and as a general entrepot where goods of all kinds could be bought and sold. By the 1650s and 1660s, Curaçao was also, quietly, one of the most important markets for pirate plunder in the entire Caribbean. Dutch merchants there bought Spanish silver from French buccaneers operating out of Tortuga, and they bought cacao and indigo and sugar from English privateers operating out of Jamaica, and they sold these goods to buyers in Amsterdam who did not particularly need to know the details of how the merchandise had made its way from a Spanish colony to a Dutch warehouse. The Dutch government was, in principle, opposed to piracy during periods when it had peace treaties with Spain. In practice, the merchants of Curaçao were too valuable a source of revenue and intelligence for anyone to shut down. This is a pattern that repeats itself throughout the history of pirate finance in the Caribbean. The most important enablers of piracy were not the pirates themselves, but the respectable commercial institutions that surrounded them, provided them with markets, gave them access to capital, and smoothed the conversion of stolen wealth into legitimate commerce. The pirates were the violent edge of a much larger system, and when that system functioned well, everyone in it, from the buccaneer captain to the Amsterdam warehouse owner, made money. Tortuga's time as the primary centre of this system was relatively brief. By the 1670s it had been largely superseded by a new and more powerful hub, the English colony of Jamaica, and specifically the port town of Port Royal, which sat on a narrow sand spit at the mouth of Kingston Harbour, and which would, for about 30 years, be the most important pirate financial centre in the history of the Caribbean. But Tortuga's contribution to the development of pirate finance was fundamental. It established the model, a protected base, a tolerant government willing to take a percentage of prizes, a community of merchants willing to finance and fence, and a set of practices around shares and articles and collective decision-making that would be carried forward into every subsequent pirate republic. When the buccaneers eventually left Tortuga for Port Royal, they brought those practices with them, and Port Royal built an even more elaborate financial structure on the same basic foundation. One more thing about Tortuga before we leave it. There is a figure associated with the island who deserves a moment of attention, precisely because he does not fit the usual narratives about piracy. His name was Bertrand d'Ogeron, the governor we mentioned earlier, and in addition to his role as a tolerant administrator of buccaneer activities, he was also a genuine entrepreneur in his own right. D'Ogeron spent years trying to turn Tortuga into a proper colonial settlement, importing settlers, encouraging agriculture, trying to build something more permanent than a pirate camp. He failed, mostly, because the buccaneers were not interested in settling down, and because the French West India Company kept cutting off his funding. But in his attempts, he demonstrated something important, that even the people most embedded in the pirate economy recognized that piracy alone could not sustain a community indefinitely. Real wealth required a diversified economy, agriculture, trade, and something to sell besides stolen goods. The pirate republic was always, at some level, a transitional form, a way of surviving until something more sustainable could be built. The tragedy, if it can be called that, was that the something more sustainable almost never arrived on time. In the summer of 1692, at about 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, the ground beneath Port Royal, Jamaica, began to move. It moved in a way that the inhabitants, about 2,000 of them, packed into one of the most densely populated and most prosperous small towns in the Americas, had never felt before. The sand and mud on which the town had been built, a narrow spit of land extending into the harbour, liquefied. Buildings that had stood for decades sank into the earth. The harbour floor shifted and a wave of water surged up over the waterfront. In approximately 2 minutes, 2/3 of the town of Port Royal slid into the sea. Perhaps 2,000 people died in the earthquake and the flooding that followed. The survivors would spend years afterward reporting that they had seen, through the suddenly clear harbour water, the streets and buildings of the sunken part of the town below them, the rooftops of warehouses, the tilted walls of taverns, the spires of the church, where many of the town's merchants had recently sat in respectable Sunday worship. The earthquake of 1692 has always been interpreted by the pious and the dramatic alike as a kind of judgment. Port Royal had been, in its heyday, one of the most extraordinary places in the world, and also one of the most morally complicated. It was simultaneously the wealthiest town in the English Caribbean and the most notorious den of vice in the Western Hemisphere. It was a place where legitimate merchants and licensed privateers and outright pirates all did business together, where the line between legal commerce and organised plunder was so thoroughly blurred as to be effectively invisible, where colonial officials took their cut and asked no questions, and where the proceeds of some of the most violent raids in the history of the Americas were converted, week by week and year by year, into respectable commercial wealth. The earthquake destroyed it all in 2 minutes, and the moralists of the day said that this was exactly what such a place deserved. What those moralists did not say, and what historians have been untangling ever since, is that Port Royal was also genuinely important, not just as a symbol of transgression, but as a real economic institution that shaped the development of the English Caribbean, and through it, the trajectory of Atlantic commerce in the late 17th century. Understanding how Port Royal worked, how it was financed, and who benefited from it requires setting aside both the romantic pirate mythology and the moral condemnation, and looking at the actual mechanics of how the place operated. England had seized Jamaica from Spain in 1655, during Oliver Cromwell's Western design, an ambitious and mostly unsuccessful attempt to knock Spain out of the Caribbean and establish English dominance over the region. The seizure of Jamaica was essentially the only success of the Western design, and even it was somewhat accidental. The English fleet, having failed in its primary objective of capturing Hispaniola, attacked Jamaica as a consolation prize and found it rather more easily taken than expected. The island was large, fertile, and strategically positioned, but it was also poorly defended and lightly populated. The Spanish had never invested heavily in Jamaica, and when the English arrived in force, the Spanish settlers simply fled, abandoning their plantations and their capital, Santiago de la Vega. The English government, now in possession of a large island it had not entirely planned to acquire, faced a problem. Jamaica needed defending, and England did not have the resources to garrison it properly. It also needed developing. Someone needed to clear the land, plant crops, build towns, and it needed to be connected to the larger Atlantic economy, which required a working port. The English authorities solved all three problems with a single policy. They encouraged the buccaneers. By the late 1650s and early 1660s, the English governor of Jamaica, the most important of these early governors being a man named Sir Thomas Modiford, who arrived in 1664 and would run the island for the next 7 years, had established what amounted to an open invitation to privateers of any nationality to use Port Royal as their base, as long as they restricted their attacks to Spain. Jamaica would provide the letters of marque, the privateers would provide the defence. Port Royal would grow rich on the proceeds, and the English crown would receive a percentage of every prize brought in. Modiford himself was not a naive man, and he was not naive about what he was doing. He was a plantation owner, a lawyer, and a political operator of considerable skill, and he understood perfectly well that the policy he was implementing was legally and diplomatically problematic. He maintained a careful paper trail of letters of marque and official authorizations, but he also understood that many of the men operating under those authorizations were stretching their licenses far beyond what was formally permitted, and he chose to look the other way as long as the silver kept flowing into Port Royal's warehouses. The wealth of Port Royal in its golden years, roughly 1660 to 1690, is almost difficult to comprehend in modern terms. Contemporary accounts describe warehouses packed floor to ceiling with silver coin, with cacao, with indigo, with hides, with every kind of luxury good that could be stripped from a Spanish merchant ship or looted from a Spanish colonial town. The merchants of Port Royal had, by the late 1670s, accumulated enough capital to make the town one of the most important trading centres in the Atlantic world, not just in the Caribbean, but in the broader sense of a node through which significant flows of wealth passed and from which they were distributed outward. The town's physical structure reflected this wealth. Port Royal in 1680 had approximately 6,000 to 7,000 inhabitants packed into an area of about 50 acres, which made it more densely populated than London at the same time. It had brick buildings of 2 and 3 stories. It had a substantial fort, Fort Charles, still standing today, with enough cannon to make any attacking fleet think twice. It had warehouses, counting houses, a slave market, at least 100 taverns, by some contemporary counts, a church, several small chapels, a court, a jail, and every other institution of a functioning colonial town. It had a bustling market where goods from 3 continents were bought and sold every day. What it did not have was any particular anxiety about how all this wealth had been generated. The merchants of Port Royal operated in a state of collective moral convenience. Everyone knew, in general terms, that the privateers who brought silver into the harbour had taken it from Spanish ships and Spanish towns by force. Everyone also knew that the letters of marque issued by the governor made this technically legal, at least during the frequent periods when England and Spain were at odds. And in the periods when England and Spain were formally at peace, which created obvious problems for the letter of marque system, the merchants of Port Royal had developed a variety of creative legal interpretations that allowed them to continue doing business with the privateers while maintaining the fiction that everything was entirely above board. The most important of these fictions was the distinction between prizes taken before a peace treaty was formally announced in the Caribbean, which, given the communication delays of the era, could be months after the treaty was signed in Europe, and prizes taken after. A peace treaty signed in London in March might not reach Jamaica until July, and anything taken between March and July was, in the Port Royal legal community's creative interpretation, entirely legitimate. This gave privateers operating out of Port Royal a useful window of technical legality, and it gave the merchants who bought their prizes an equally useful defence against any accusations of receiving stolen property. The financial infrastructure of Port Royal was more sophisticated than that of Tortuga in several important respects. First, it was connected to the English metropolitan financial system in ways that Tortuga, a colonial backwater of marginal interest to Paris, was not. The merchants of Port Royal had credit lines with London houses. They could draw bills of exchange on London banks. They could move wealth between Jamaica and England through the financial instruments of the day, which meant that the proceeds of piracy could be converted relatively cleanly into metropolitan capital and invested in entirely legitimate enterprises. This conversion process was the key to understanding how pirate wealth permeated the legitimate economy. When a successful privateer captain returned to Port Royal with, say, 100,000 pieces of 8 taken from a Spanish merchant fleet, that money did not simply sit in a chest. It moved. Some of it went to pay the crew and the outfitters. Some of it went to the governor and the admiralty in the form of officially owed percentages. But the remaining portion, typically the captain's own share plus whatever he had borrowed against his share in advance, went into the Port Royal commercial economy. It paid off loans. It was reinvested in new voyages. It was used to buy land or build warehouses. It was deposited with merchants who had put it to work in the trade between Jamaica and England. The London end of this system was handled by commission merchants, agents who received consignments of goods from Jamaica, sold them in English markets, took their percentage, and forwarded the proceeds back to their Jamaica clients in the form of credit or goods or bill of exchange. These commission merchants were, in the aggregate, among the most important financiers of the pirate economy, because they were the mechanism by which Caribbean plunder was converted into English capital. They did not generally ask difficult questions about the origins of the goods they were selling. Some of them may not have known, or may have been deliberately incurious. Others certainly knew and did not care because the margins on goods that had been acquired through violence and sold at prices that reflected their distressed origins were extremely attractive. The economic historian Nuala Zahideh, who spent years researching the commerce of Port Royal, found in the records of the period that somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the goods traded through Port Royal in its heyday had origins that were, at best, legally ambiguous. She found evidence of commission merchants in London maintaining separate accounting systems for goods of clear legitimate origin and goods that required more careful handling. She found evidence of insurance being written on cargoes whose origins the underwriters had been deliberately not told. She found, in other words, exactly the kind of institutional machinery for laundering stolen wealth that one might expect to find in a society that was officially committed to the rule of law, but practically dependent on the proceeds of a major theft economy. Port Royal had a physical character that matched its economic character, loud, crowded, prosperous, and on some level aware of its own precariousness. The taverns that lined the waterfront were, by contemporary accounts, extraordinary places. Not just drinking establishments, they were also meeting rooms, employment agencies, credit institutions, and intelligence hubs. A captain looking for crew would post his articles in a tavern and wait for men to come and sign them. A merchant looking for captains willing to take on a particular cargo would make his inquiries in a tavern. A governor's agent looking for information about what was happening on the Spanish Main would sit quietly in a tavern corner and listen to the conversation. The taverns of Port Royal were, in a very real sense, the information exchanges of the pirate economy. The women of Port Royal deserve at least a mention here, because they have been almost entirely written out of the history despite having been genuinely important participants in the town's economy. Women ran many of the taverns, they ran boarding houses, they ran some of the smaller shops, they extended credit to sailors in the intervals between voyages. They were, in some cases, accumulating their own capital and investing it in their own right, not in privateer voyages typically, but in the real estate and commercial enterprises that grew up around the pirate economy. When Port Royal sank into the sea in 1692, the women who survived had to rebuild their lives from scratch, and the records of their claims for compensation in the aftermath of the earthquake give us one of our best windows into the texture of ordinary commercial life in the town. One of the most commercially active women in Port Royal was a woman known only by her business name, Widow King, who ran what appears to have been one of the most successful taverns and boarding houses in the town through most of the 1670s and 1680s. The records of disputes she brought to the colonial court give us a picture of an entrepreneur who was routinely extending credit of hundreds of pieces of eight to sailors and merchants who owned property in multiple parts of the town, and who had developed sophisticated methods for recovering debts from men who had every incentive to disappear. She was, by any reasonable measure, a significant figure in the Port Royal financial community, and she's almost entirely absent from the histories of the period, which is itself a kind of statement about what those histories have chosen to notice. In the late autumn of 1670, a fleet of 36 ships carrying approximately 2,000 men assembled in the harbour of Hispaniola and prepared for the most audacious operation in the history of Caribbean piracy, the crossing of the Isthmus of Panama and the sack of Panama City, the richest Spanish city in the Americas, the gateway through which the silver of Peru flowed on its way to Spain. The man who had assembled this fleet negotiated its financing, recruited its captains and crew, and organised the political cover that made it legally possible, at least in his own mind and in the minds of his backers in Jamaica, was a 45-year-old Welsh farmer's son named Henry Morgan, and what he was about to do would make him one of the most famous and most controversial figures of his century. Morgan is often presented as the archetypal pirate hero, rough, brave, brilliant in battle, extravagantly drinking and ultimately triumphant. He ended his career as Sir Henry Morgan, Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, a man who spent his later years hunting down the same pirates he had once led. This arc from lawlessness to respectability is one of the great stories of the age, and it is true as far as it goes. But what it obscures is something more interesting. Morgan was not simply a brilliant fighter, he was a brilliant financier. The Panama expedition was not just a military operation, it was a financial operation of extraordinary sophistication, and understanding how Morgan structured and funded his major expeditions tells us more about the mechanics of pirate economics than almost any other single story. Morgan had been operating in the Caribbean since at least the early 1660s, first as a sailor and then as a junior captain in various privateer expeditions. He had the essential qualities of a successful buccaneer commander: physical courage, tactical intelligence, and the ability to command the loyalty of diverse and difficult men. But what distinguished him from other capable captains was his understanding of the organisational and financial dimensions of large-scale raiding. The typical privateer expedition of the mid-17th century involved a handful of ships and a few hundred men. Morgan thought in multiples of those numbers. His great expeditions, the raid on Puerto Principe in 1668, the sack of Portobello in the same year, the raid on Maracaibo in 1669, and finally the Panama expedition of 1671, all involved coordinating dozens of ships and thousands of men, many of them operating under different captains with different financing arrangements, and different levels of commitment to the overall mission. Pulling these expeditions together required not just military command authority but something much more like executive management. The ability to negotiate, to build consensus, to structure agreements that gave every participant enough of what they wanted to keep them committed, and to maintain those agreements under the enormous pressures of a military campaign in unfamiliar territory. The financing of the Portobello raid is particularly instructive. Portobello, now in Panama, was at that time one of the most important Spanish ports in the Americas, the terminus of the Camino rail over which silver from the Peruvian mines was carried before being loaded onto the treasure fleet. It was guarded by 3 forts, manned by professional soldiers, and considered by the Spanish military to be essentially impregnable. Morgan attacked it in June of 1668 with roughly 470 men in 12 ships and took it in a matter of days. The plunder was extraordinary. Estimates vary, but contemporary accounts suggest that Morgan's forces carried off silver bullion, coin, and goods worth somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000 pieces of eight, an enormous sum, equivalent to many years' wages for any of the men involved. How had Morgan financed the expedition that took Portobello? The most important source of finance was, of course, the profit. From previous expeditions, Morgan had accumulated capital from earlier raids, and he invested some of it in the Portobello venture. But he had also arranged for credit from the merchants and outfitters of Port Royal, who were willing to provision a much larger expedition than usual because of Morgan's track record of successful returns. He had arranged for the financial participation of Governor Modiford, who had issued the letter of marque and whose formal involvement gave the expedition political protection as well as a degree of official prestige, and he had structured the agreements among the participating captains in a way that aligned their incentives. Each captain's share of the final plunder was proportional to the size of his ship and crew, which meant that the captains of larger ships had strong incentives to recruit as many men as possible and to maintain discipline throughout the campaign. The Panama expedition of 1670–71 was the apotheosis of Morgan's financial genius, and it is worth examining in some detail. By this point, Morgan was not just a successful captain, he was a major figure in the Port Royal establishment, a member of the Governor's Council, a significant property owner, a man with connections at the highest levels of both the colonial government and the London merchant community. He had accumulated enough personal capital from his previous raids to be, in his own right, a substantial investor in the Panama venture. He was, simultaneously, the military commander, the chief executive, and one of the major financial backers of the largest privately organised military expedition in the history of the Caribbean. The structure Morgan developed for the Panama expedition was essentially that of a joint stock company applied to military raiding. Each participating captain contributed his ship and crew to the common enterprise. Each received in return a share of the total proceeds proportional to his contribution, calculated according to a formula that had been negotiated and agreed before the expedition departed. The formula accounted for the number of men each captain contributed, the size and armament of his ship, and the captain's own experience and reputation. Morgan received a larger share than anyone else, not just as commander but as a major investor. This structure had several important advantages. It spread the risk. If the expedition failed, no single captain bore the entire loss. It aligned incentives. Every captain had a personal financial stake in the success of the whole, not just his own ship's performance. It created a clear governance structure. Major decisions required agreement among the senior captains, which prevented any single figure from taking actions that benefited himself at the expense of the others. And it made the financing of the expedition tractable. By bringing together dozens of ships and their backers, Morgan could assemble a force that no single investor could have funded alone. The financial parallels to the joint stock trading companies of the same era, the East India Company, the Royal African Company, the Hudson's Bay Company, are not coincidental. Morgan and his associates were operating in the same intellectual and commercial environment as those companies. They had seen how the joint stock model allowed the concentration of capital for large and risky enterprises. They had adapted that model to their own purposes. The fact that those purposes involved violence and theft rather than trade did not change the underlying financial logic, which was elegant and effective. The Panama campaign itself was a military triumph of a particularly grueling kind. Morgan's force crossed the isthmus on foot, fighting through jungle and swamp, battling Spanish resistance along the way, subsisting on minimal rations after their supply ships failed to keep pace. When they arrived at Panama City and defeated the Spanish force sent to stop them, they found that the city had been set on fire by the Spanish themselves, who preferred to destroy their own town rather than let it fall into Morgan's hands intact. The exact circumstances of the fire have been debated ever since, with some historians arguing that Morgan himself ordered it to flush the Spanish out of the buildings where they were making a last stand. Whatever the cause, the fire meant that much of the city's movable wealth had already been carried away by its citizens before Morgan arrived. Morgan's forces spent several weeks at Panama, torturing prisoners for information about where wealth had been hidden, searching the surrounding countryside, and systematically stripping the ruins of anything valuable. When they finally returned to the Caribbean coast, they carried with them an enormous but somewhat disappointing haul. Disappointing relative to expectations, that is. The total plunder of the Panama expedition has been estimated at somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000 pieces of eight, which was by any normal standard a staggering sum. But divided among 2,000 men, it worked out to roughly 200 pieces of eight per person, significantly less than many had expected given the city's legendary wealth. There were accusations, which Morgan denied, that he had manipulated the accounting to increase his own share at the expense of his fellow captains. These accusations were never definitively proven, but they poisoned his relationships with several of the captains who had served under him and contributed to the eventual collapse of the Port Royal privateer community. The financial governance that had worked so well during the expedition itself proved harder to maintain when it came to dividing the actual money, because the temptation to shade the numbers in one's own favour was always present, and the mechanisms for enforcing honest accounting in a community with no reliable court system were limited. Morgan's subsequent career illustrates something important about the relationship between piracy and legitimate authority. After the Panama expedition, he was briefly arrested and sent to London, not for piracy, but as a political gesture towards Spain, whose government was furious about the attack. But in London, he was treated with considerable deference. He had powerful friends, men who had invested in his expeditions and profited from them, men who saw him as a useful instrument of English commercial and strategic interests. After 2 years of comfortable house arrest, during which he was extensively interviewed by officials who found his knowledge of the Caribbean extremely valuable, he was not only released but knighted and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. As Lieutenant Governor, Morgan spent considerable energy hunting down pirates, including former associates of his own, in a campaign that has sometimes been characterized as hypocrisy but was more accurately a reflection of changing political and economic realities. By the late 1670s and 1680s, the English government had decided that the privateer economy had served its purpose in Jamaica and was now an obstacle to the more respectable commercial development it wanted to encourage. The same financial infrastructure that had made Port Royal rich was now making it difficult to attract the legitimate investors and planters who were needed to develop the sugar economy that would become the real economic engine of the Caribbean. Morgan understood this perfectly, and his willingness to turn against his former colleagues was not a betrayal of principle. It was simply the rational behaviour of a man who had always operated according to the principle that money and power were more important than loyalty, and who had now made his money and secured his power on the respectable side of the line. The year is 1715, and the Caribbean is changing. The great age of the licensed buccaneer, the era of Morgan and Modiford and the profitable fiction of the letter of marque, is essentially over. The major European powers have, with varying degrees of sincerity, agreed that piracy in the Caribbean is bad for business, and they have begun actually trying to suppress it, rather than merely claiming to while quietly investing in it. The result has been a diaspora. Hundreds of men who had been operating under the protection of one colonial government or another have been pushed out to the margins, stripped of their legal cover, and forced to make a choice between going straight and going fully outlaw. Most of them, given that going straight meant poverty, and that going fully outlaw meant at least a chance at wealth, chose the latter. And many of them converged on a single place, the island of New Providence in the Bahamas, and specifically the small, nearly landlocked harbour on its northeastern shore that would come to be known as Nassau. New Providence in 1715 was theoretically an English colony. It had been settled by English planters in the 1660s, had struggled economically for decades, and had been repeatedly raided and burned by the Spanish and French in the wars of the late 17th century. By 1715, it had no functioning government to speak of. The last royal governor had fled several years earlier when a combined French-Spanish force attacked. No garrison, no naval protection, and no law enforcement of any kind. It was, in the most literal sense, a place where the normal rules did not apply. For the growing community of men who had been pushed outside those rules, it was perfect. The founding generation of the Nassau Pirate Republic was led, in a loose and informal sense, by a man named Benjamin Hornigold, who had been operating in the Caribbean since at least 1713, and who had a talent for attracting followers and building consensus that made him something approaching a natural leader in a community that was very suspicious of leaders. Hornigold is an interesting figure precisely because he was not, by temperament, an anarchist. He believed in organisation and in rules. He just believed that those rules should be made by the people who were going to live under them, not imposed from above by governors and admirals who had never spent a night in a Caribbean harbour. The system that emerged under Hornigold's informal leadership in Nassau between about 1715 and 1718 was, by any reasonable assessment, one of the most democratic political arrangements in the early 18th century Atlantic world. Major decisions, whether to attack a particular target, whether to accept a particular ship into the community, how to divide the proceeds of a successful raid, were made by majority vote among the assembled captains and their senior officers. The votes were roughly proportional to the size of the force a captain commanded, but every captain had a voice, and every crew had at least informal representation through its officers. The economic arrangements of Nassau built on the earlier buccaneer traditions but added new elements. The articles that governed individual voyages continued to specify shares and injury compensation in elaborate detail. But at the community level, Nassau developed something more like a commons, a shared infrastructure of the harbour, the careening beaches where ships were cleaned and repaired, the freshwater sources and the market for plunder, all of which were available to any member of the community on the understanding that they would contribute to its defence and maintenance when called upon. This was not a formal property rights system. It was more like the economic arrangements of a medieval village. Collective ownership of essential resources, individual ownership of personal property and a ship's cargo, and social pressure as the primary enforcement mechanism. The financing of Nassau piracy had some distinctive features that set it apart from the Port Royal model. The most important was the role of wrecking. The year 1715 happened to be an extraordinarily productive one for treasure hunters, because in that year a fleet of 11 Spanish treasure ships, heavily loaded with silver from the mines of Mexico, was caught by a hurricane off the Florida coast and destroyed, with the loss of perhaps 1,000 men and an estimated 14 million pieces of eight in cargo. The survivors made it to shore in Florida and established a rough camp, but they had no way to raise the wrecked ships from the sandy bottom. The pirates of Nassau heard about this within weeks and moved with impressive speed. Over the following months and years, they sent diving expeditions to the wreck sites, crude operations by modern standards, using free divers who could hold their breath for extended periods and descend perhaps 30 or 40 feet to pick up whatever they could find on the bottom. The amount they recovered was significant. Contemporary estimates suggest that Nassau-based pirates recovered somewhere between 50,000 and 500,000 pieces of eight from the 1715 wrecks, competing with official Spanish salvage efforts in a race that was simultaneously a diving competition and a high-stakes legal argument about who had the right to property that had technically belonged to the Spanish crown. The financing of these wreck diving operations was interesting because it was, in some respects, even more formally organised than the financing of raids on ships and ports. The diving expeditions required specific equipment: diving platforms, buckets, tools for prying silver ingots loose from the sand, and they required men with specific skills who might command premium compensation. There are records from the Nassau period of diving agreements that look remarkably like modern salvage contracts specifying the share that divers would receive, the share that would go to the vessel owners, and the share that would be retained as a community fund for the maintenance of Nassau Harbour. The human geography of Nassau during these years was extraordinarily diverse. The island's several hundred permanent residents were joined at any given time by hundreds of additional pirates passing through, coming in to sell plunder, repair ships, recruit crew, or simply rest between voyages. Among this floating population were men from virtually every European nation, and from Africa and the Americas as well. The presence of free black men and escaped slaves in the Nassau pirate community is one of the most historically significant and least commonly discussed aspects of the whole era. The pirate articles were, at least formally, colourblind in ways that the surrounding colonial societies emphatically were not. A black sailor who had earned his freedom, whether through flight from a slave owner or through years of service, with a pirate crew, could sign the articles of a Nassau captain and receive his equal share of whatever the voyage produced. This was not universal altruism. It was practical recognition that a fighting man was a fighting man regardless of his colour, and that a system that discriminated arbitrarily would lose the best fighters to systems that didn't. The most famous figure to emerge from the Nassau period was, of course, Edward Teach, known to history as Blackbeard. Teach is such a fixture of popular mythology that it is difficult to see him clearly through the accumulated layers of legend, but the historical Blackbeard is, in some ways, more interesting than the myth. He was a large man, physically imposing, with an extraordinary talent for psychological intimidation. The burning fuses woven into his beard were not personal decoration but theatrical props, designed to make him look terrifying and thereby encourage potential victims to surrender without a fight, which saved everyone time and danger. He was also, by the evidence of his surviving correspondence and the accounts of people who knew him, genuinely intelligent and genuinely interested in the political dimensions of what he was doing. Teach had been a sailor before he became a pirate, probably serving as a privateer during the War of Spanish Succession, and he had enough experience of legitimate commerce and legitimate governance to understand both how they worked and why they worked in ways that were profoundly unfair to people without money or connections. His commitment to the Pirate Republic was not simply a default position forced on him by lack of alternatives. It was, by the available evidence, a genuine choice, a preference for a community organised around collective decision-making and shared profit over the hierarchical and exploitative arrangements of the legitimate world. Teach's commercial instincts were, by the standards of his time and trade, sophisticated. He did not simply take ships and sell their cargoes at whatever price the market offered. He studied the market. He understood that certain goods, sugar, cacao, indigo, needed to be sold through particular channels to get their full value, and he maintained relationships with merchants in the American colonies, particularly in North Carolina, where the colonial government was notably tolerant of commerce with pirates, who could move these goods into legitimate markets. He understood that the timing of a sale mattered. Flooding the market with a particular commodity immediately after a large seizure would drive down prices, while holding some of the cargo back for a later sale could significantly increase total returns. These are not the instincts of a simple thug. They are the instincts of a commodity trader. Blackbeard's famous alliance with the governor of North Carolina, Charles Eden, is one of the clearest examples of the silent partner dynamic that ran through the entire history of pirate finance. Eden was not a pirate. He was a royal official, a man with a formal commission from the crown, a man who sat in council and administered justice and corresponded with the Board of Trade in London. He was also, by the evidence of multiple contemporary accounts, accepting a significant share of Blackbeard's plunder in exchange for providing legal cover, specifically a legal fiction under which captured ships were declared to have been taken as prizes under the terms of the Act of Grace, a royal pardon for pirates that had been issued in 1717. Eden presided over what amounted to a piracy court that declared Teach's takings to be legitimate prizes and pocketed a substantial percentage of the proceeds. The Nassau Republic reached its peak in terms of economic activity in 1717 and 1718, when the community of pirates based there had grown to perhaps 1,000 men with dozens of ships, and the flow of plunder through the harbour had reached a scale that was beginning to genuinely disrupt legitimate commerce across the Caribbean and along the American colonial coast. The disruption was severe enough that it finally pushed the English government to act, not with the usual half measures and paper commissions, but with real enforcement in the form of a new governor named Woodes Rogers, whose commission specifically mandated the suppression of the Nassau pirates. Rogers arrived in Nassau in the summer of 1718 with a small naval force, a royal pardon for pirates who surrendered, and a set of hanging warrants for those who refused. The reception he received was complicated. Some of the Nassau pirates, including Hornigold himself, accepted the pardon and went straight, some of them becoming, in the fashion of Morgan a generation earlier, active participants in the suppression of their former colleagues. Others, including Teach, simply sailed away and continued operating elsewhere. A few were captured and hanged, providing the dramatic public executions that Rogers correctly understood were essential to establishing that the new regime meant business. The Nassau Republic as such was over, but its legacy was more durable than its short formal existence might suggest. The ideas that had been developed and practiced there, about collective decision-making, about shared profits, about the rights of ordinary sailors against the authority of captains and owners, percolated outward through the pirate diaspora and influenced the communities that formed afterward in other parts of the world. The article systems, the compensation schedules, the voting procedures, these travelled with the men who carried them in their heads, and they reappeared wherever those men ended up. There is a name that appears in the records of colonial New England in the late 1690s and early 1700s, with a frequency that seems, at first glance, unremarkable: Frederick Phillips. He was a merchant, he was a landowner, he was a member of the New York Colonial Council, he was one of the wealthiest men in the American colonies, with a manor house in Yonkers and business interests that stretched from Albany to the Caribbean. He attended church, he participated in civic life, he was, by the formal criteria of his society, a pillar of it. He was also, by the evidence of his business records and the testimony of his trading partners, one of the most important financiers of piracy in the Atlantic world during his time, not on the fringes, at the centre. The financial historian Robert Ritchie spent years tracing the networks that connected the pirates of the Indian Ocean, men like Thomas Tew and Henry Avery and William Kidd, to their investors and outfitters in the American colonies, and what he found was a system of remarkable sophistication, centred not on Nassau or Port Royal, but on New York and Boston and Newport, Rhode Island, where respectable merchants with cold heads and hot money transformed piracy from a Caribbean enterprise into a global one. The story of how this happened requires a brief geography lesson. By the 1680s and 1690s, the Caribbean was becoming, in commercial terms, a victim of its own success. So many pirates were operating in the region that the easiest Spanish targets had been repeatedly raided and were now heavily defended. The Spanish treasure fleets, having learned from a century of attacks, now sailed in larger convoys with heavier escorts. The English and French and Dutch colonies, having extracted what profit they could from the privateer economy, were beginning to see piracy as more disruptive than useful. Their own merchant ships were now targets as often as Spanish ones, and the insurance costs and lost cargoes were starting to outweigh the benefits of the informal privateer economy. The Caribbean was getting smaller and more dangerous as a theatre of operations. The pirates, with the pragmatism of people whose survival depends on correctly reading their commercial environment, began looking elsewhere. And elsewhere, in the late 17th century, was largely east: the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the coast of West Africa. These were places where the European trade companies, the East India Company primarily, were accumulating enormous wealth through the spice trade, the textile trade, and increasingly the slave trade. The ships that carried this wealth were, by Caribbean pirate standards, lightly defended, heavily loaded, and operating in waters so far from any European naval base that a successful attacker might escape into the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean without fear of pursuit. The logic was compelling, and the economics were extraordinary. The Mughal treasure ships that crossed the Indian Ocean between the Red Sea ports and the west coast of India were, in terms of cargo value per ship, among the richest targets in the world. A single successful attack on one of these vessels could yield more than the proceeds of years of Caribbean raiding. The risk was correspondingly high, the distances involved were enormous, the weather unpredictable, and a ship that ran into trouble in the middle of the Indian Ocean had nowhere to turn. But for men who had been calculating risks and rewards all their professional lives, The arithmetic of the Indian Ocean was persuasive. The Madagascar connection, the establishment of pirate bases on the island of Madagascar and its surrounding smaller islands, was the infrastructure innovation that made the Indian Ocean enterprise possible. Madagascar itself was large enough to supply fresh water and provisions, remote enough to be beyond the effective reach of any European naval power, and positioned perfectly as a base for raids on both the Red Sea trade routes and the shipping lanes between India and the Persian Gulf. The first significant pirate bases on Madagascar were established in the early 1690s, and by the turn of the century the island had a pirate community of several hundred men with their own governance structures, their own economic arrangements, and their own supply networks connecting them to the American colonies. Those supply networks are where Frederick Phillips comes back in. The Madagascar pirates needed provisions, ammunition, and trade goods. They needed somewhere to sell what they captured. Indian Ocean plunder included spices, textiles, gold, silver, and jewels that needed to be converted into usable currency. And they needed, every few years, the ability to retire from the trade, return to the colonies, and spend their money in relative safety. Phillips and a network of similar merchants in New York, Boston, and Newport provided all of these things. The mechanics worked like this. A merchant like Phillips would outfit a ship, let us call it a sloop, since sloops were the preferred vessel for this trade, fast and shallow drafted enough to navigate the complex coastal waters where the pirates operated, with a cargo of provisions, powder, shot, and trade goods suitable for the Indian Ocean. The ship would sail ostensibly as a legitimate trader to the Red Sea or Madagascar or wherever the current concentration of pirates happened to be. There it would exchange its cargo for plunder. Indian textiles, pieces of 8, gold coin, whatever the pirates had accumulated. It would then return to New York and sell these goods through channels that asked no questions, delivering a substantial profit to the original investors. The legal cover for this operation was provided by the ambiguity of the trade laws of the day, combined with the very practical willingness of colonial officials to look the other way when merchants of substance and political connection were involved. Phillips had been on the New York Council for years. He knew the governor, he knew the customs officials, he knew the judges who would hear any prosecution. In this environment, the legal risks of the Madagascar trade were, for a man, in his position, essentially negligible. The financial risks were the ones that actually mattered. A ship that was lost at sea or taken by a hostile navy represented a real loss of investment, and Phillips managed his exposure carefully, diversifying his investments across multiple voyages and maintaining enough legitimate trade to absorb the losses from any individual failed venture. The social world that surrounded this trade in the American colonies has been reconstructed piece by piece by historians who have spent years in the colonial records, and what they have found is something considerably more comfortable and well organized than the word conspiracy might suggest. The men who financed the Madagascar pirates were not conducting their affairs in secret, frightened back rooms. They were doing business in the open, in the coffee houses and counting rooms and council chambers of the colonial establishment. The fiction that separated their activities from outright piracy, the fiction that they were simply trading with whoever happened to be in port, with no particular knowledge of or responsibility for the origins of the goods they were buying, was thin, but it was sufficient, because everyone who might have challenged it had a personal financial interest in not doing so. The historian Marcus Rediker has argued that this network of colonial merchant financiers represents one of the most important and least recognized examples of what he calls the Atlantic system of capital accumulation, the way in which wealth generated through violence and exploitation at the periphery of the European economic system was systematically channeled into the metropolitan centres through networks of finance and commerce that made the violence invisible by the time the money arrived. This is not just a point about pirates. It is a point about the fundamental structure of the Atlantic economy in the 17th and early 18th centuries, in which the line between legitimate commerce and organised robbery was drawn by the powerful for the convenience of the powerful, and erased whenever the profitable thing to do required erasing it. The specific case of the Madagascar trade also illustrates how piracy could function as a kind of tax on imperial commerce. The East India Company, whose ships were the primary targets of the Indian Ocean pirates, spent enormous sums in the 1690s and early 1700s lobbying the English government for suppression of the Madagascar trade and for military action against the pirate bases. They were not wrong that the pirates were costing them money, but what they did not acknowledge, and perhaps did not fully understand, was that the same colonial merchants who were financing the pirates were also important nodes in the East India Company's own supply and distribution networks. The system was sufficiently integrated that attacking the pirates meant disrupting relationships with merchants who were otherwise valuable, commercial partners, and the government had to balance those competing interests in ways that often resulted in half measures and delays. This tension between suppression and co-optation, between the pressure to eliminate piracy and the interests of too many powerful people in maintaining it, runs through the entire history of pirate finance in the Atlantic world. It explains why suppression was so often delayed, so often selective, and so often followed by rehabilitation of the very figures who were supposed to be its targets. The English government hanged enough pirates to maintain the principle that piracy was illegal, but it also pardoned enough and quietly tolerated enough to ensure that the underlying commercial system remained functional. This was not, in most cases, a conscious policy decision. It was the emergent result of 100 individual decisions made by people with competing interests and imperfect information, each acting rationally from their own perspective and collectively producing an outcome that nobody had explicitly designed. Among the most revealing documents from this period are the records of the trial of William Kidd, the Scottish captain who had been commissioned in 1695 to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean, and who ended up, under circumstances that remained genuinely controversial, attacking ships he was supposed to be protecting. Kidd was captured, brought to London, tried, and hanged at Execution Dock in 1701, and his trial was one of the great political spectacles of early 18th century England. What made Kidd's trial politically sensitive was the identity of his original backers. When Kidd had been commissioned in 1695, his voyage had been financed by a syndicate that included some of the most powerful Whig politicians in England, including the Earl of Bellamont, who had become Governor of New York, and several members of the Privy Council. These men had put up substantial sums for the venture and had expected to share in the profits of whatever Kidd captured. When Kidd was arrested and his connections to their syndicate became public, the political stakes were suddenly enormous. A successful prosecution of Kidd for piracy would imply that the men who had financed him were, at minimum, investors in an enterprise that had turned criminal. The trial was conducted under considerable political pressure to limit the damage to Kidd's powerful former backers. Evidence that would have helped Kidd's defence, specifically the French passes that he claimed, proved that his most controversial prizes had been legitimate French ships taken under the terms of his commission, mysteriously disappeared from the Public Record Office and were not found again until 1910, when a researcher discovered them misfiled among unrelated documents. Whether their disappearance was deliberate suppression or bureaucratic accident has never been established. What is clear is that without those documents, Kidd's defence was fatally weakened, and that several witnesses whose testimony might have helped him were unable or unwilling to appear. Kidd hanged. His more powerful backers were not charged. The East India Company, which had lobbied hardest for his prosecution, emerged from the affair with its preferred narrative intact. Kidd was a rogue who had turned pirate, and his financiers were innocent investors who had been deceived. The reality, as historians have subsequently established, was considerably more complicated. Kidd had operated in a zone of deliberate ambiguity created by his commission, his backers, and the political environment of the 1690s, and when that zone of ambiguity became politically inconvenient, he was the one who paid for it. Henry Avery was not supposed to be a legend. He was supposed to be an ordinary sailor from the west of England, a man of no particular distinction who had worked the slave trade and the Royal Navy and the merchant service with no remarkable success. In 1694, he was serving as first mate on a Spanish-chartered privateer called the Charles II, waiting in the harbour of La Coruña in northwestern Spain for the ship's captain to sort out a contractual dispute with the Spanish merchants who had hired them. The dispute dragged on for weeks, and then for months, and the crew, unpaid, underemployed, growing restless in a foreign port, began to discuss alternatives. On the night of May 7th, 1694, those discussions culminated in action. Avery led a mutiny, took command of the ship, renamed it the Fancy, and sailed it out of La Coruña with 80 men, and the intention of making his fortune. Over the next 2 years he would do exactly that. in a manner that would make him the most famous pirate of his generation and trigger a diplomatic crisis between England and the Mughal Empire. The Mughal connection is the heart of the Avery story, and it requires understanding what the Red Sea trade was and why it mattered. Every year, in the season of the Hajj, a fleet of Muslim pilgrim ships and merchant vessels would sail from the port of Surat on India's west coast, through the Arabian Sea and up the Red Sea to the port of Jeddah near Mecca, carrying pilgrims, spices, textiles, gold, and silver. The return voyage would bring different cargo, more gold and silver, goods purchased in the markets of the Arabian Peninsula, the wealth that the empire's merchant class had accumulated in a year of trade. These ships were the property of the Mughal emperor's courtiers, merchants, and family, and they carried wealth on a scale that made the Spanish treasure fleets look modest. Avery found the Pilgrim fleet in August 1695 in the mouth of the Red Sea, and over 2 days he and a small fleet of allied pirates attacked and captured 2 of the largest ships, the Fateh Muhammad, which yielded 50,000 pieces of eight, and the Ganji Sawai, the flagship of the fleet, which was one of the largest ships in the world at the time, carrying up to 400 passengers and a cargo whose value, in modern terms, would be measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. The capture of the Ganji Sawai was a feat of genuine naval audacity, and the violence that accompanied it was extraordinary even by the standards of an era accustomed to violence. The ship's captain resisted. Avery's men fought their way aboard. What followed has been described in multiple contemporary accounts as a massacre and a systematic rape of female passengers, including, it was alleged, women of the Mughal court. The specific allegations have been disputed by historians. Some details appear to have been exaggerated in the English press to increase the sensation of the story, but that the attack was extremely violent and extremely profitable is beyond question. Avery's share of the plunder alone has been estimated at 1,000 pieces of eight, plus an enormous quantity of gold and jewels. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb was furious. He had English East India Company factors, merchants, living in Surat under the protection of his empire, and he held them personally responsible for the actions of his subjects. He imprisoned the company factors in Surat, seized the company's trading post, and informed the English government that further trading rights in the Mughal Empire depended on the capture and punishment of Avery and his associates. The East India Company, whose entire business model depended on access to the Indian trade, was suddenly and very directly threatened by the consequences of a pirate attack that had nothing to do with them, except that the attackers were English. The company lobbied the English government with extraordinary urgency. Avery became, in the space of a few months, the most wanted man in the world, officially. The English government issued proclamations, offered rewards, sent warships, and yet Avery was never caught. He landed at Nassau in the Bahamas, distributed plunder among his men, and then, according to the most plausible accounts, returned to England under a false name, attempted to sell some of his jewels through networks of dishonest merchants in Bristol, and died in poverty, having been cheated by those very merchants of most of what he had worked so hard and so violently to accumulate. The merchants kept the jewels and gave him almost nothing. It was, in a strange and grim way, the perfect metaphor for the whole relationship between the pirate class and the merchant class that financed and fenced their operations. The men who took the physical risks ultimately ended up with far less than the men who managed the money. The broader consequences of Avery's raid extended far beyond his own fate. The attack on the Mughal fleet created an international incident that forced the English government to take seriously, for the first time, the global commercial costs of tolerating piracy. The East India Company's lobbying combined with the diplomatic pressure from Mughal India created a new coalition of interest in favour of genuine suppression. Not the half-hearted, corruption-riddled suppression of previous decades, but real enforcement, with real consequences for both pirates and their financial enablers. This shift in political will, which gathered force through the 1690s and the early 1700s, is one of the major factors that eventually brought the golden age of piracy to an end. But before that end came, the Red Sea trade flourished for another decade, and its financing became even more sophisticated. The key development was the emergence of what historians have called the Red Sea Men, A loose network of captains, merchants and investors centred in New York and the other. American colonial ports who operated the Madagascar-based Piracy as a genuinely international business with supply routes, intelligence networks, and financial structures that would not have been out of place in any respectable trading house of the era. The organisational genius of the Red Sea scheme was that it separated risk cleanly between its participants. The pirates, the men who actually attacked ships and risked death, capture and hanging, bore the physical risk. The merchants who outfitted them bore the investment risk. If the voyage was unsuccessful, they lost their outfitting costs. The fences who bought the plunder bore the transactional risk. If the goods were seized by customs officials or the prices in the market moved against them, they absorbed the loss. And the political fixers, the colonial officials who provided legal cover and turned blind eyes, bore a small reputational risk, which in practice they managed by maintaining a careful paper trail of deniability. This clean separation of risks, combined with the specialization it implied, each participant doing what they were best at, was one of the reasons the Red Sea scheme was so remarkably durable. It is also one of the reasons it was so difficult to suppress. Attacking the pirates dealt with the most visible part of the system, but left the financial infrastructure intact. Attacking the merchants exposed the government to the political fallout of prosecuting prominent members of the colonial establishment. Attacking the political fixers required political will that was difficult to sustain when those fixers had important friends. The system was designed, not always consciously but effectively, to be resilient against exactly the kinds of disruption that governments were capable of applying. The Dutch factor in the Red Sea scheme deserves specific mention because it has been somewhat overshadowed by the American colonial angle. Dutch merchants, operating out of the Dutch, colonies in the Caribbean, and through Dutch trading houses in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, were among the most important financiers of the Madagascar enterprise. The Dutch were, by the late 17th century, deeply experienced in moving goods of dubious origin through respectable commercial channels. They had been doing it in the Caribbean since the early days of Tortuga, and they had developed sophisticated legal and financial structures for managing the associated risks. They brought this expertise to the Indian Ocean trade, and their participation added both capital and financial sophistication to the Madagascar enterprise that it might not otherwise have had. One specific innovation associated with Dutch involvement was the use of bills of exchange drawn on Amsterdam banks to settle accounts between Madagascar pirates and their outfitters in New York or Boston. A bill of exchange, an early form of what we would now call a cheque or a bank transfer, was a written instruction, from one party to another, authorizing a specified payment to a specified person. The genius of bills of exchange, in the context of pirate finance, was that they separated the movement of money from the movement of goods in a way that made it very difficult to trace the connection between a specific cargo of plundered Indian textiles and the merchant in New York who was receiving payment for having outfitted the ship that captured it. By the time the money had travelled from a Madagascan pirate's share through an Amsterdam correspondent bank to a New York merchant's account, the trail of origin had been thoroughly obscured. The economic impact of the Red Sea scheme on the American colonies is another dimension that has been relatively underexplored in the popular history of piracy, though economic historians have done considerable work on it. The infusion of Indian Ocean gold and silver into the money-starved colonial economies of New England and the Middle Colonies was genuinely significant. The American colonies in the late 17th century suffered from a chronic shortage of hard currency. The British government had not established a colonial mint. The colonies could not issue money backed by metropolitan authority, and the trade balances consistently ran against the colonies, meaning that whatever coin came in tended to flow back out in payment for manufactured goods from England. Pirate money bucked this trend. When a captain returned from Madagascar with a chest of Mughal gold coins and Surat textiles and Arabian silver, and that wealth was distributed through the colonial economy via the fencing networks, it added to the money supply in ways that had real economic effects. Prices rose somewhat. Credit became more available. Building projects that had been impossible for lack of capital became possible. The economic historians who have looked at the growth of colonial port cities like Newport and New York in the period 1690 to 1720 have found correlations between periods of heavy pirate activity and periods of economic expansion that are difficult to explain by any other mechanism. This is not to say that piracy was good for the colonial economies. The disruption to legitimate trade, the insurance costs, the diplomatic problems, all worked in the other direction. But the simple identification of piracy as economically destructive misses the complexity of how plundered wealth moved through these societies. Like any sudden infusion of money into a money-scarce economy, the pirate treasure of the 1690s and 1700s produced winners and losers in ways that do not map neatly onto the line between honest citizens and criminal associates. The Boston merchant Thomas Bannister left a remarkable document in the colonial record, a detailed account book from the early 1700s that tracks, among other things, his dealings with several men who he knew to have been involved in the Madagascar trade. Bannister was not, as far as anyone can tell, directly investing in pirate voyages himself, but he was buying goods from men who he knew, as almost everyone in colonial Boston knew, had connections to the Madagascar trade. He was extending credit to men who had just returned from parts unknown with more money than they could plausibly have earned through legitimate commerce. He was, in other words, participating in the fencing and money-moving end of the pirate economy, while maintaining enough distance from the actual raiding to preserve his own respectability. His account book is, in miniature, a perfect portrait of how the colonial merchant class managed the moral and legal risks of the pirate economy, close enough to profit from it, careful enough to deny involvement. The suppression of the golden age of piracy was not, in the end, primarily a military achievement. It was a financial and political one. The pirates were not defeated because someone finally built a navy powerful enough to hunt them down on the open ocean. The open ocean was too big and the pirates too mobile for that approach to work reliably. They were defeated, insofar as they were defeated, because the financial and political systems that had sustained them were finally reorganized in ways that made the cost of tolerance outweigh the benefits. This reorganization happened at several levels simultaneously, and it was driven by different actors with different motivations. At the level of international commerce, the East India Company and its equivalents in other European countries had, by the early 18th century, achieved enough political leverage to force genuine suppression of the Indian Ocean pirates. The Mughal crisis triggered by Avery's attack had demonstrated in unmistakable terms that tolerating piracy in the Indian Ocean had real costs for the most important trading relationships of the European commercial empires, and those costs were ultimately borne by the companies and merchants whose access to the Asian trade depended on maintaining those relationships. The political will to suppress piracy was, in the end, generated less by moral principle than by commercial self-interest, which is consistent with how the political will to tolerate it had also been generated. At the level of the American colonies, the suppression was driven by a combination of imperial pressure and changing local interests. By the early 1700s, the sugar economy of the Caribbean was maturing, and the planters and merchants who had built it were increasingly finding that the disruptive effects of piracy on legitimate commerce outweighed the benefits of access to cheap plundered goods. The calculation that had led their fathers and grandfathers to welcome the pirates was no longer working in their favour, and they began with the same pragmatic self-interest that had led them to embrace piracy in the first place, to support its suppression. Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in July 1718 with a commission as the first Royal Governor of the Bahamas, a small naval squadron, and a royal pardon, the Act of Grace, that offered amnesty to any pirate who surrendered within a specified period. Rogers was a fascinating figure, a former privateer himself who had led a circumnavigation of the globe in 1708 to 1711 and had made enough money from it to retire respectably, but who had lost much of his fortune in subsequent business ventures and had taken the Nassau Commission partly as a way of rebuilding his finances. He understood the pirate world from the inside, which made him both more effective and more ruthless in dealing with it. The Rogers Commission was, in some ways, the most sophisticated anti-piracy operation yet attempted. It combined the carrot of pardon with the stick of military force, and it did so in a way that took seriously the economic logic of why people became pirates in the first place. The pardon was genuine. Rogers followed through on it for the hundreds of men who accepted it, and he found employment for many of them in the colonial militia or in legitimate maritime trade. The hangings that followed for those who refused or who reoffended were equally genuine. Rogers hanged 8 men in a single day in November 1718, making the point unmistakably clear that the era of flexible enforcement was over. Among those who accepted the pardon and went straight was Benjamin Hornigold, the man who had done more than anyone to build Nassau into a functioning pirate republic. Hornigold became, under Rogers, one of the most effective pirate hunters in the Caribbean, a fact that his former colleagues regarded with bewilderment and fury, and that historians have interpreted in various ways. Some see it as simple survival instinct. Hornigold recognised that the tide had turned and adapted accordingly. Others see something more principled, that Hornigold had always been operating from a set of ideas about fairness and self-governance that, in a changed political environment, could be pursued through legitimate channels as well as illegitimate ones. The truth was probably some combination of both, filtered through the particular personality of a man who was, above all, a pragmatist. Blackbeard refused the pardon and was killed in November 1718, barely 4 months after Rogers arrived in Nassau, by a naval detachment sent from Virginia under the command of Lieutenant Robert Maynard. The fight was brief and violent. Maynard's force surprised Teach's sloop adventure off the coast of North Carolina and boarded her after a bloody close-quarters fight in which Teach himself was shot multiple times and stabbed multiple times before finally dying. Maynard had Teach's head cut off and hung from the bowsprit of his sloop as he sailed back to Virginia, a gesture that was both practical, proof of the kill necessary to claim the reward, and symbolic, the most visible possible signal that the old arrangements were over. What happened to the wealth that the pirates had accumulated? This is one of the most tantalizing questions in the history of Caribbean piracy, and it is also one of the most difficult to answer precisely, because the nature of the wealth and the way it was distributed made it inherently hard to trace. Some of it was seized by Rogers and other suppression agents, ships, goods, whatever could be found and confiscated. Some of it was hidden, buried, or otherwise concealed by pirates who knew that the reckoning was coming and wanted to preserve something for an uncertain future. Some of it had already been spent in the taverns and boarding houses and gambling establishments of Nassau and Port Royal and every other port that had ever welcomed a returning pirate crew. But a significant portion of the wealth that the golden age of piracy generated was, by the time of the suppression, already thoroughly embedded in the legitimate economy. It had been converted into land, into buildings, into ships and cargoes and credit and all the other forms that wealth takes in a commercial society. The merchants who had fenced and financed pirate voyages had long since reinvested their proceeds in sugar plantations and trading houses and colonial real estate. The colonial officials who had taken their percentages had built comfortable homes and educated their children in England and passed their money on to their grandchildren, who knew nothing about its origins and would have been horrified to be told. This is perhaps the most important and least comfortable point about the financial legacy of the golden age of piracy. A significant portion of the accumulated wealth of the Atlantic world in the 18th century had piracy in its lineage. Not all of it, not even most of it, but enough to be historically significant, enough to complicate any clean narrative about honest commerce and criminal outlawry as distinct and separate things. The sugar fortunes that funded the country houses of 18th century England, the shipping dynasties of New England, the great merchant banking houses of Amsterdam and London, many of them had, somewhere in their early history, a moment when a captain came into harbour with a hold full of plunder and a merchant on the dock was ready to buy without asking too many questions. The buried treasure legend, the idea that pirate captains routinely buried their wealth on desert islands, waiting to return for it, is almost entirely a product of later fiction, most specifically of Robert Louis Stevenson's novel Treasure Island, published in 1883, which essentially created the modern image of piracy out of whole cloth, and imposed it retrospectively on a real history that was considerably more complex and considerably more interesting than Stevenson's story. Real pirates did not typically bury their treasure. They spent it, invested it, or were cheated out of it. The burial myth is appealing precisely because it implies that there is still wealth waiting to be found, that the story is not over, that the pirates are still out there in some sense, that their money is still waiting in the ground for someone clever enough to find it. There have been treasure hunters on every island in the Caribbean, at one point or another, looking for evidence of buried pirate gold. Most of them have found nothing, because there was nothing to find. The wealth of the Golden Age was liquid, not buried. It moved through the economy as money and goods and credit, not as static hoards in wooden chests. The exception that proves the rule is the case of the 1715 treasure fleet, whose wrecks actually are on the bottom off the Florida coast, and which have yielded significant amounts of silver to salvage operations over the past 3 centuries. But those were not buried by pirates. They were sunk by a hurricane, and the difference matters. It was nature, not human cunning, that preserved that silver for later discovery. The real legacy of pirate wealth is more diffuse and more interesting than a buried chest. It can be found in the architecture of the Caribbean ports that grew rich on the proceeds of the privateer economy, in the old stone buildings of Kingston, Jamaica, some of which date from the post-earthquake rebuilding of what had been Port Royal's merchant district. It can be found in the records of the New England shipping houses, whose fortunes were built, at least in part, on the Madagascar trade. It can be found in the legal and financial traditions of the Atlantic world, where some of the innovations first developed in the pirate economy. The joint stock expedition, the collective articles, the compensation schedule for workplace injuries, eventually found their way into legitimate commercial and labour law. The pirate articles, in particular, represent one of the most striking instances of institutional innovation arising from an unexpected source. The democratic governance structures, the injury compensation systems, the defined shares and profit-sharing arrangements that buccaneer captains and their crews developed in the 17th century were, in important respects, more sophisticated and more equitable than anything the legitimate commercial world of the same period had to offer ordinary working sailors. The historian Marcus Rediker has argued in his book Villains of All Nations that the pirate ship was, in some ways, a laboratory for social and economic arrangements that the larger Atlantic world would not formally adopt for another century or more, arrangements in which workers had a voice in how their enterprise was governed, in which risk was shared rather than concentrated at the top, and in which there was at least an attempt to provide for those who were injured in the common enterprise. This argument should not be overstated. The pirate economy was also, inarguably, built on violence, and the people who suffered most from that violence were not the pirates or their merchant backers, but the sailors and passengers of the ships that were attacked, the inhabitants of the towns that were raided, and the enslaved people who were bought and sold as part of the pirate trade in human beings. Because however democratic the pirate articles were, they existed within a world that depended on slavery, and many of the pirates participated in that world, buying and selling enslaved people along with every other commodity that passed through their hands. The democratic arrangements of the pirate republic were, like the democratic arrangements of ancient Athens, available only to a fraction of the people whose labour and suffering made them possible. Still, the ideas that were developed in the pirate economy did not simply disappear when the Golden Age ended. They travelled, in the heads of surviving pirates, and in the printed accounts of writers like Exquemelin, into the broader culture of the Atlantic world. They influenced the development of maritime labour law, which began, in the 18th century, to develop more formal protections for sailors against the absolute authority of ship captains. They influenced the thinking of the colonial rebels who, in 1776 and afterward, began arguing that governments derived their legitimacy from the consent of the governed, a principle that the buccaneers of Tortuga and the pirates of Nassau had been practicing imperfectly and violently for a century before any political philosopher made it formal doctrine. The Caribbean itself continued after the Golden Age to be shaped by the economic patterns that piracy had established. The sugar economy that replaced the privateer economy was in many respects built on the same foundation, the same ports, the same trade networks, the same connections between colonial merchants and London financiers, the same tolerance for exploitation in the service of profit. The difference was that the exploitation was now conducted in a more systematized and legally sanctioned form through the institutions of the slave trade and the plantation system, rather than through the more chaotic and personal violence of the pirate raid. The historians who have written most insightfully about Caribbean piracy, Rediker, Zahidia, Ritchie and others, have all in various ways made the point that the transition from the privateer economy to the plantation economy was not the clean break between savagery and civilization that contemporary commentators like to portray. It was a reorganization of the same underlying system of Atlantic exploitation, with different instruments and different beneficiaries, but the same fundamental logic. Wealth extracted from the periphery, moved through financial networks, and accumulated at the centre, with the violence that made it possible hidden behind legal and institutional structures designed to make it invisible. This is why the story of pirate finance in the Caribbean is not simply a historical curiosity, a colourful chapter in a distant past. It is, in a more uncomfortable way, a story about the origins of the modern Atlantic economy, about how the financial institutions and practices that we take for granted were built, in part, on the proceeds of organised robbery, and about how the line between legitimate commerce and criminal enterprise has always been drawn by those with the power to draw it, in ways that served their interests and legitimised their own violence, while condemning everyone else's. As we come to the end of this particular journey, from the forests of Hispaniola, where the first buccaneers smoked their meat on their boucan frames, through the harbours of Tortuga and Port Royal and Nassau, across the Indian Ocean to the wreck of the Ganges Sawai, and back again to the counting houses of New York and Amsterdam, it seems worth pausing for a moment to take in how much has changed and how much has not. The Caribbean is still there, of course, the same islands, the same sea, the same improbable blue of the water that astonished the first European sailors who saw it. Nassau is still there, a modern city now, full of banks rather than pirates, though the historians will tell you that the distinction is perhaps not always as clear as the bankers might prefer. The wrecks of the 1715 treasure fleet are still on the bottom of Florida, and people are still diving on them, still occasionally pulling up silver coins blackened by 3 centuries of salt water. The forts that the buccaneers built on Tortuga are ruins, but they are still standing, still looking out over the same harbour where the ships of the free companies once anchored. And in the archives, in London and Madrid and Amsterdam and Paris and Port Royal and New York and Nassau, the records are still there too. The letters of marque with their elaborate legal language, the buccaneer articles with their meticulous schedules of injury compensation, the account books of the merchants who moved the plunder, the trial records of men who were hanged for doing openly what others did quietly and were honoured for. All of it is still there, patient as the silver on the ocean floor, waiting for people willing to go looking. The great pirate republics of the Caribbean lasted, in their various forms, for about a century, roughly from the establishment of Tortuga as a buccaneer base in the 1630s to the suppression of the Nassau Republic in the 1720s. In historical terms, this is not a long time, but in terms of the ideas they generated, the financial innovations they pioneered, and the way they illuminated, by contrast and by extension, the workings of the legitimate commercial world around them, their influence has been much longer lasting. We are still, in certain ways, working out the implications of what they built and what they destroyed, which is perhaps the most fitting possible conclusion for a story like this one. The golden age of Caribbean. Piracy did not end cleanly. The ships were burned or captured or simply rotted away. The captains were hanged or pardoned or died of fever in forgotten harbours. The treasure was spent or stolen or converted into the bricks and mortar of a new order that was, in its bones, built on the same foundation as the old one. But the ideas, the practices, the questions that the pirate republics raised about who gets to make the rules and who gets to keep the profits, those did not sink with Port Royal, and they did not hang at execution dock with the men who had lived by them. They are still circulating, quietly, like silver coins in deep water, catching the light from angles that depend on where you are standing and how carefully you are looking. And that is where we will leave them tonight, in the deep water, in the warm dark, still glinting faintly in the current of time. Let the weight of the story settle around you. Let the harbours and the ships and the counting houses and the articles and the buried silver all drift down into the comfortable quiet that comes after a long journey. The Caribbean is still there, the story is still unfolding, and you are here, resting, which is exactly where you should be.